and welcome to My Counselor Live. My name is Brittany East, and this week we're taking a slight detour from our typical format to dive into some sex therapy Q&A with one of our beloved counselors. Today joining me is Alison Pitts, and she is ready to share her biblical wisdom and clinical insight into a topic that might seem a little taboo for the Christian culture. Before we dive in though, Alison, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself for the audience members who may not know you yet?
Of course. Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, so my name is Alison, and I have been a counselor at MyCounselor.Online for 2.5, going on 3 years. Absolutely love working for this company. I love having that space to integrate like biblical truth with like excellent clinical work and the freedom that we have at this company to do that. I love working with couples going through like relationship issues, whether it's sexual or communication or whatever else. I absolutely love doing that kind of work. It's really fun to see the Lord heal lives in that way, and it's just really powerful. I also work with individuals as well, but I just love all of it. I couldn't think of doing anything else other than counseling. It's the best.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, and I love that this is supposed to be like a healing process, a safe place. And I love that all of these questions that we're about to go over are from our viewers, like you guys. Questions that have been submitted either like on YouTube comments or specifically, we do have a question portal. So these are from MyCounselor.Online/ask. If you go to there, and that link will also be in our show notes, you can submit any questions about sex therapy, about any mental health concern, a counseling question, and we will answer them in future episodes. But today we're focusing specifically on the sex therapy questions from our viewers. So our first question, Alison, that we're going to be talking about, she says, "My husband is my best friend and we have a wonderful relationship. However, he's not the best in bed. I feel like our relationship is suffering because of it. What should I do?"
I think that is such a great question, because I think there's a lot of couples that experience that, where they have all these strengths and all of this compatibility and this amazing relationship, but then when it comes to their sexual relationship, it just feels like a disconnect is there, and they're having a hard time kind of managing that and working through that, and there's something about that doesn't feel like it's working. So I'm so grateful that that person asked that question. I think that that's so good. So typically when I have couples coming in to see me and they're having issues similar to this, I think the biggest thing that I always encourage, I think in general, it tends to be women that tend to feel that way, tend to encourage women to like speak up. The biggest thing in a sexual relationship is communication. Men have different arousal experiences. They experience sex just so very differently than women do, and their bodies are not attached to a woman's nervous system, right? So if a husband is doing something, they might think it's awesome, or they think that it's a really great idea, but if it's doing nothing for you, it behooves you to say something like, hey, that's maybe not as great as I would like it to be, or it could be, like, maybe let's try this, right? I think like in our culture, we have this false perception that the more sexual partners you have, the better you're going to be, in bed, right? When the reality is like every single woman is so unique in how they're wired and what feels good to them, that a man isn't going to know what's going to work for this partner as opposed to what's going to work for this partner. And so really leaning into that communication piece and actually like taking the time to explore, if what we're doing isn't working, let's figure out what does work, and having that safety and having that openness in the relationship, since it sounds like this relationship in particular has so many strengths, right? Like lean into those strengths, have a conversation, try to figure out what does work for you and what does feel good, and you and your husband get to go on kind of like this new adventure together of like rejuvenating your sexual relationship and kind of going on this journey of figuring out what does work for you.
That makes sense, and I appreciate that, like, it's just another adventure together. Like, it doesn't have to be awkward. Do you feel like some people feel awkward bringing this up with their spouses, that they may not be quite as satisfied as maybe the other spouse thought they would?
Oh my gosh, yes, that is so normal. I think the fear in bringing that up is like, oh, what if you think I'm judging them, or I think they're not good enough, or like, is this gonna cause a fight, right? It's just, I think it's really normal for there to be a lot of apprehension and nervousness, and like, how is this going to go over if I bring this up that I'm actually not super happy in our sexual relationship, right? But my encouragement is like, you're investing in the future, right? The
Mm,
more the more enjoyable the sexual relationship is for both partners, the more you're both going to want to step into that space and continue to go back there and keep enjoying that together, right? And so really it's investing in the future and investing in like this really important aspect of the relationship, even though it is kind of awkward, like ripping that band-aid off, right? And saying something first. Of course that feels uncomfortable, but just how much of an investment it is to step into that.
yeah, I love how you're framing it also as like an investment. It's worth it. I feel like sometimes, an investment means that like the cost might be great, but like there's an even greater reward, on the other side is what it seems like. So, yeah, I really appreciate all of your insight into that. And I think it is true. You think about any other conflict within a marriage, like generally the resolution is talking about it. So even though sex maybe seem like this whole separate category, like it makes sense that talking about it is kind of the way through, just like we would have any other issue.
Right. And I think like as you were talking, Brittany, I just thought of like another piece of that. Like when we have emotional stuff going on, I think it's a little bit easier to like ask for what we need, right? Like,
Yeah.
hey, like that common thing, like, I don't need you to fix that. I just need you to listen, right? And I think like using that same skill in the sexual relationship of being able to communicate your needs, like this is actually what works for me, or this actually sounds like it might be better if we try this over here, right? And like just communicating your need is such an important part of any relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, transitioning to our next question,
Mhm.
someone else's concern that we're really excited to address. They said very little pre-marriage counseling prepares couples for the possibility of mismatched libidos when it comes to sex. How can couples recover from this?
Yes. So I so appreciate this question because typically what the research shows is that like 80% of men have higher libidos and 20% of women have higher libidos, right? So if you do that math, it pretty much means that like every single marriage is going to, at least a very high percentage of marriages are going to have mismatched libidos.
Oh, sorry, do you
Um,
mind clarifying what a libido is for anyone who may not
oh, yep,
know what that is?
of
Before we
course.
dive
Yeah.
in.
Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah.
Just that a libido is just like your sex drive. Like how often does that sound like a great idea to you? How often does your body tell you like, yes, I want to engage in that sexual touch, sexual release sounds like something I want right now,
Okay. Okay.
basically. So libido is that thing inside of your body that's saying, yes, sex sounds like a great idea.
No, that was a great
Yeah.
summary.
Yeah. And it's so normal. Like I think every single couple that I've ever worked with has said that they have different levels of sexual desire in their marriage. And so I think it's a great thing to start the conversation around, like what does that look like? What is the like desire for that? Like some men might say, I would love to have sex every day. That sounds great. And some men might say, nope, I'm good, like once a week, like that's fine, and again it kind of comes back to that idea of communication, like what is the desire that's there, what is like if you could paint an ideal picture of what that looks like, what does that look like for a couple. And I do think it's important to, like, I love the pre-marriage counseling piece, so important to have that conversation with someone if you're engaged of kind of what does a sexual relationship look like? Do you have any expectations around that? What are those expectations? And what's a place where you guys can meet in the middle and stay connected? Typically, if I'm working with couples who have mismatched libidos, my encouragement is to stay connected physically, even if it's not intercourse, right?
Okay.
That I think sometimes we can tie all physical touch with intercourse sometimes if we do have mismatched libidos, because then all touch for the person with lower sex drive, touch might be interpreted as like, I expect intercourse, right? Like sometimes that can sound like, oh, if my husband's coming up to give me a hug, he's only showing me this affection because he's expecting sex later. And that we want to avoid that if at all possible, because typically that's not really what's going on, right? And so really, even if there's nights where one partner is like, hey, that sounds like fun, what are you doing later? Like, let's connect in that way. And the other partner's like, I am exhausted, I don't think he can meet you there. That's okay, but to still stay connected physically and maybe engage in some other physical activities. It's not intercourse, but that still feels connecting, that still feels safe, that what maybe you do have energy for, because really all that is a bid to feel close, a bid to feel connected. And so kind of still leaning into some activity, even if it's not intercourse, if that feels safe.
Yeah, I love that you obviously want to make sure maybe the person with the lower sex drive, the lower libido, is feeling safe and not just like driven to do all these things that maybe they're not comfortable with, or maybe they're just physically unable to do, like tiredness or something. Yeah, I'm a mom of 2 young kids,
It's
just
real.
being able, like that energy, in the evening especially is really low for me. So, yeah, I appreciate though that you don't want to miss like maybe even what intercourse is really about. And it's really about connection. It's not just the act of sex, it's really about 2 people coming together who love each other and just wanting to show that, and just trying to be creative in other ways, maybe so that the person with the higher libido can still feel that connection that they're seeking. The person with low libido can like kind of meet in that middle ground. So I really appreciate that. And the question, they kind of mentioned that like very little pre-marriage counseling prepares that, like, if someone were in pre-marriage counseling, how do you prepare for that? Especially maybe if someone has never had sex before and maybe doesn't know, like, do you have any questions, or like, how could someone even start to think about that before they marry someone?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Brittany. I think like there's a lot of really good books out there. Like Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts has kind of some guided questions in there for a couple that's looking towards marriage. But what I will say is kind of just like even starting the dialogue around sex. Like, what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to in that? Do you have any like nervousness or apprehension? Like, what do you think? What do you want that to look like now? Really? Because the idea with premarital counseling, at least in my brain, if 2 people have never had intercourse before and they're getting married, it's a little bit harder to have specific dialogue around that. But I think at least for me, my heart for a couple in that space is, how can we just like open the door to that conversation so when you do get married, it doesn't feel uncomfortable to talk about it again, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, oh, hey, before we got married, we kind of talked about like maybe this was an ideal that we would connect sexually X amount of times a week. Now that we're married, we found like maybe that's a little bit different than we thought it was going to be, right? But we're just kind of like starting the conversation so that when you get married, it can be an ongoing conversation, and you guys as a couple can iterate, right? What do we want this to look like? What does make sense for our lifestyle and our bodies? And now that we're noticing this and leaning into this part of our lives that feels kind of new, there's space, it's going to change.
Yeah.
You're going to learn about yourself in a very experiential way, right? It's just starting that conversation doesn't feel as uncomfortable to maybe start it later on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate just that it's a continuation. It doesn't necessarily mean like everything is planned out. This is the plan. We can't defer from the plan, but
Exactly.
at least it's started. So like, I think even go back to our other question, we don't want to let the sex area of our lives become this like awkward, like tensiony area. It should be like a fluid conversation. Like, how am I feeling? How is their sex life? It's just part of who we are in a relationship. So,
Exactly.
um,
Mhm.
so when you were answering that question too, I just thought of, I feel like, well, I don't know, it's, just talking to people maybe who haven't had sex before and they're getting married. Do you feel like a lot of people have like, expectations of like what's a good sex life for how many times they have it, like type of thing? Like that's a good libido, that's a bad libido or anything?
I think, yeah, I think some people do kind of carry that type of a mentality for one reason or another. Um, and like that's so common. Like people are taught such interesting things about sex in the world,
Yeah.
right? Like I've heard some things like there's men have a 72-hour rule where if they don't have sex for 72 hours, then there's this like pressure that builds up and they have to release it and I remember I wasn't taught that, so that felt new to me, and my face did what your face is doing, Brittany. That's interesting. But some people are taught that there's like these different rules around a sexual relationship, and like, gosh, people are unique enough that I don't think that we need the rule book. There's not a hard and fast rule. If you're not having sex X amount of times a week, then you're doing it wrong. I think like kind of like you use the word fluidity. There is a fluidity in
Mm,
a couple's sexual relationship. There's going to be seasons where maybe like one or both people are really stressed out at work, and that lowers libido for some people,
mm,
right? For women, being tired is a really big barrier to wanting to connect sexually. It's less of a barrier for men, kind of what the studies show, but for women, it is a really significant barrier. And so I think that the idea is just how do we still stay connected,
yeah.
even if intercourse is maybe hard to find, like what are those spaces where we can still feel connected in this? Physically, we're still on the same page. We're still present with each other, because it's going to like shift and change in different seasons of life based on stress, based on kids, right? And so having that open dialogue between the two of you and just making sure that the two partners in the couple are saying where they're at and being honest with each other and really checking in of like, how is that for you? How are you doing? How is this going right now? Like, how are we doing? Right? And having that openness. But to answer the question, no, I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule. I think if there's like we have sex once a year, like I would maybe be concerned about that. But other than that, I think kind of, for lack of a better word, within normal range, it really does depend on the couple.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that clarity. And I'm sure our viewers, 'cause I think there is maybe even sometimes different church cultures. It's like, well, your marriage is good if it's on this level, and maybe not good if it's like over here, but just trying to normalize every couple's the uniqueness. I love that. Like every couple is unique, every season's unique. Like there's so many factors to come into that. We can't just like put rules on sex life for good and bad or whatever. Or do you have any comments on that, or you get to go on the next question?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, just reiterating, like as long as both parties are good with where it's at and they're like having an open dialogue about it, I think that those are the things that I would maybe want to look at for sure.
Awesome. All right. So our next concern, they say, I feel like my husband is only interested in our relationship because of the sex. In the past, your videos have mentioned that sex is supposed to be bonding for a couple, but I don't think that is the case for us.
Yeah, yeah, that comments like that always break my heart, because I do hear that sometimes with the people that I work with, of feeling like, well, my spouse only wants me for my body. They don't actually care about who I am as a person. And I want that person to know like they're not alone. That's a really common thing that I hear. And I also kind of want to speak to some pieces of that it's normal for that to be an experience because of how God wired our bodies. Like for women, women like to feel bonded and connected emotionally. I think, right, that was kind of painting with a broad brush, right? That women like that emotional connection, they like talking, like chatting, but men are only in it for the sexual relationship and they like that piece. But there's this really interesting biological thing inside of our bodies that happens that I think is fascinating and kind of contributes to this. But when we feel bonded and close to someone, a hormone is released in our brain called oxytocin. And that is the hormone that makes us feel close and connected to someone. Okay. And so for women, oxytocin just floods the brain in those emotional conversations, in those places where they're chatting, they feel connected, they feel close, because there's oxytocin happening in their brains. And then after that, it feels a lot safer and a lot easier to enter into sexual contact because you feel close and bonded with someone. Okay? For men, it's a little bit different. Men get a flood of oxytocin in their brains after orgasm. So men feel really bonded and really close and really connected after intercourse because they had that flood of oxytocin. And so it's after that that they're like, okay, now we can have a conversation. How are you feeling? Sometimes, depending on the man, right? Yeah. And so it's kind of this like kind of tricky, sometimes can feel like a mean trick, like, Lord, why did you wire us this way? Right? And something that I think I like to think of, it's just kind of an Alison's personal opinion about this. But it's almost like the Lord in his wisdom kind of put these different mantles on a husband and a wife in a marriage, where the husband gets to say, hey, wife, come over here. The sexual relationship is so beautiful and connecting. And the wife is saying, hey, husband, come over here. This emotional bonding feels so good and so close. And I love connecting with you in this way. Right? You're kind of gently bringing each other into center, because you both, like, a husband needs an emotional connection and a wife needs a physical connection, right? And you both need both pieces of that, and you get to kind of just gently bring each other into those spaces. In terms of kind of going back to this comment of only feeling like your husband is interested in you because of sex, I would just be really curious about, like, maybe that's his one way that he knows to get close to you and doesn't know any other way, right? And he feels close to you in that space. And then the other question I would have is, like, how is the emotional connection? How is that for you? What's that like? And maybe encourage you to, like, get help, whether that's for you as an individual or for you guys as a couple, because I believe, like, those mixed signals, because of kind of what's happening biologically, that oxytocin, that we misinterpret a husband's desire for sexuality as using us, when maybe it's just the only way that they know how to connect. I don't know. Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns in that. Like, I'm guessing and making assumptions here, but something to just be curious about, and maybe even something to express to your husband and bring that to him of, like, I want to feel closer to you emotionally, and we start to ask to bring him into that with you. You know, because I don't want that for you, for your relationship long term. That's not going to be sustainable in your heart.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And I appreciate just how you're talking about, like, it's just like it sometimes, yeah, like you talk, it's feel frustrating from God. You know, I've even thought about that. Like, I feel like it's like super easy for like men to orgasm and have that connection than it is for women. Like, why aren't women wired that way to, like, you know, just be able to get it done?
Right.
But it is like kind of taking a step back and, like, okay, like, but like God does things for a reason, or like with intention, I guess maybe is a better way to say it. And I love that. Yeah, I kind of like that, the idea of like a mantle, like, okay, the husband, like, this is his role, and it can be a beautiful role to remind the wife, like, let's connect physically. And for the wife, like, that's a beautiful role to remind the husband to connect emotionally. And I just really love, yeah, how you like phrase that. So it's like neither one is like better or worse, or like deeper or shallower. It's just different, and it's connecting in a different way, and kind of feeding the oxytocin in a different way, and kind of meeting, like you said, like meeting in the middle, so that everyone gets a flood of oxytocin.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think as well, just really remembering that God's heart and God's intention for a sexual relationship between a husband and a wife is like unity and oneness and mutuality. That both spouses are bringing their whole selves into this incredibly vulnerable space, right? That it's not just your body is present, but your brain is somewhere else, right? Like you're bringing your whole self into that space, and that can be really vulnerable and that can be really scary. But that like it can be connecting and it can be really powerful. And I believe that that's God's heart. It's an expression of unity that is unique to a husband and a wife.
Yeah, that's beautiful. All right, so this is our last question for today. And I'm very interested to get your thoughts on it. So the questions, there's two questions. It says, is oral sex or anal sex okay within marriage? Are these God-given desires or a flashback of a struggle with porn?
I think that's a great question. And I think questions like that are difficult, obviously, because the Bible doesn't address it directly, right? Like there isn't that verse that we can reference on oral sex or anal sex in the Word, at least that I'm aware of or that I've found in my study. And so typically with questions like this, I always like to start with the fact that where you land on that is a very personal thing between you and the Lord. Always at the end of the day, like you're not answering to your pastors, you're answering to God, right? And so to really be intentional to do the work and seek the Lord out and figure out kind of where you land and what feels congruent to you in your relationship with God and your relationship with your spouse, right? With that being said, I do feel like I heard my coworker one time talk about like you have to find in relationship, you have to find the spaces where like God says it's okay, you say it's okay, and your spouse says it's okay. Right? And where all three of those circles overlap, like a triple Venn diagram, where all three of those circles overlap is where you want to land in your sexual relationship. So if you have one spouse that says like, no way, I believe oral sex is bad and gross and I'm not interested in it, that's where you have to land. That can't be a part of the sexual relationship because all parties need to feel honored and respected and safe in that space. Right? Or, there's some sexual things that some people engage in, like threesomes or swinging, that I personally do believe that the Bible or the Lord like wouldn't be okay with, right? And so that maybe falls out of the realm of what's okay in that. In regards to anal sex, again, I feel like still follow that same process of does that feel okay inside of me? Does that feel okay with my partner? Something that I think is interesting in a way that we kind of understand God is through his creation, right? The anus isn't really designed for that type of thrusting. It's not designed for that. The vagina is very flexible and it can get bigger, it can get smaller. It's kind of designed to have that type of pressure and thrusting and activity, and it can still recover after that. It doesn't cause damage. With the anus, it's not designed for that. And so if there is a lot of that kind of thrusting, that kind of activity and penetration, that it does cause damage over time. And so that's something to maybe keep in mind in that. Kind of looking to creation of how God designed things. But again, that ultimately at the end of the day is between that couple and the Lord. So I tend to not be super prescriptive on some of those things, but because it's such a personal and intimate thing. In terms of the flashbacks of a struggle with porn, I would be really curious about that for that person. That can be a piece of it. Is maybe some unhealthy messaging around sex and sexuality that people have gotten from pornography or kind of the world's influences, for lack of a better word. So I think that that's something that I would encourage that person to explore a little bit and kind of do some internal work and say, where is this coming from inside of me, right? And what do I feel, what does honor the Lord and what does honor my spouse in that?
No, that makes sense. And I know, and like how it really is a lot of communication, a lot of even bringing things to God, and like wanting to see God's heart, God's intention for all these things, for why we get oxytocin in certain ways, like why, how we're going to have sex together, how we're going to connect together, and really seeking out like God's viewpoint, and then bringing it down to between you and your spouse. Okay, like what's our comfort level, what's our safety within that, and then and then obviously kind of figuring out from there, depending on people's backgrounds, like where the porn can come into play or not, depending on someone's exposure or not. So
yeah. And I think like something that I always like to encourage couples with as well is, as humans, we're made in the image of God, right? And God is a creative God, right? Like I'm sure there's like all kinds of things in a sexual relationship that the Lord is like, that would be awesome, guys, go try that, right? Like, go have fun, kids, like, and so there's that piece too. Like, those were two very, very specific questions that I wanted to speak to, but that my responses aren't meant to be restrictive, that is a space between two people that gets to be so full of life and creativity and exploring and like just enjoying each other in new ways and finding and discovering new ways to like keep that space kind of lively and fresh, I think is good too. And so just in that, know that there is a lot of creativity in that space, and it's a good thing to kind of explore and figure out what does work.
Yeah, and I love that there is a lot of freedom within that, because in theory there should be a lot of safety in that, like how God designed marriage is to be this very safe place where you can be creative, free without judgment. So you can kind of stumble around like as you're figuring things out or trying to have fun. It can look like you're kind of fun, for each other, because it's safe. So
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, that's all our questions today, Alison. Before we wrap up, do you have any like final thoughts or advice that you'd want to share with anyone, maybe who's, or anyone who maybe who's looked into sex therapy or is receiving sex therapy or anything like that?
Yeah, I think, I always like to encourage my couples that like safety and communication and unity are always the goal. Like, it's about connection between you and your spouse. That's the whole point. And if you have the thought of maybe we need sex therapy, maybe we need this, that just try it. I think for me personally as a counselor, I really do value and recognize like the sacredness of that space. And I don't take that lightly. And it can be really, really helpful to just get an outside opinion and have a safe place, someone to facilitate those conversations if you're nervous about it. And so, I think just encourage people, if you're considering it, if you're thinking about it, like, give it a try. If it doesn't work, you can always not come back. So.
Amen. Our freedom. It applies to a lot of areas.
Yeah, there's safety, right?
Awesome. Well, Alison, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your insight and really just your heart for couples, just to feel that like love, connection, and safety that that God wants for them. It's very clear that your heart, like, you want that for people. You want them to be able to experience like the true joy that connecting sexually can bring. And so I really appreciate you sharing all your insight and just openness with our viewers today. And thank you everyone for watching and listening today. And thank you for the ones who have submitted questions. Again, we are always open to questions. We answer questions every week on our live episodes. If you go to MyCounselor.Online/ask, you can submit your questions that way. They're always shared anonymously. There's no way, to trace it back to you or anything. And we will give our counselors professional input on them. If you haven't already, be sure to just subscribe to our channel and follow us on social media. On Facebook, we are at facebook.com/lovemycounselor. On Instagram, our handle is @lovemycounselor. And on YouTube, it is youtube.com/MyCounselor.Online Christian Counseling. We are so grateful for everyone who joined us today, and we'll see you next week on My Counselor Live. Have a great week.